Uh, with that, we are going to dive into aquatic marine species. So literally dive in with Edmond giving a presentation on mapping of aquatic species. Edmond is a researcher at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. He completed his PhD at James Cook University in Australia. And he's part of many wonderful projects around marine conservation and mapping. And I think I'll let you dive into them now.
Thank you very much. Is that?
No,
Can you hear me?
no, I think. Yes.
Now? Yes. Great. Thank you. So I can use this to point, or I need to plug it into my... Okay, great. Is there a laser pointer? Yes. Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Edmond Sacre, and thank you for the introduction. And thank you, Olaf and Alexis, for inviting me here. It's really exciting to talk about our work in front of quite a different crowd to what I'm used to presenting in front of. So I work at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, and despite the name, we work a lot on aquatic environments. Our department is actually the largest at the university. And, excuse me. So our unit is called the Unit for Marine Conservation and Spatial Planning, and these are all the lovely people in our unit. And they're all ecologists, including myself. So I am not an expert in AI by any stretch of the imagination. And unfortunately, the problem with ecologists is they always just look for any excuse to go snorkeling or get out into the field, and they're not usually interested in modeling. But we have managed to assemble a team of modelers, partly, who are really interested in this stuff. And I see lots of opportunities to use AI for our research. And thank you, Ocean, for the preface, because I think it was a perfect preface summarizing a lot of the same challenges that we're facing in the sea. So I thought I could divide our work into sort of two sections. The first being biodiversity mapping, and the second being conservation planning and decision making. And I'm actually going to go backwards in my presentation. I'm going to first talk about conservation planning and decision making, because I think it makes it easy to understand why biodiversity mapping is so important. So you may have heard about the Global 30 by 30 initiative, which is this goal to protect 30% of land and seas by the year 2030. So we have about 5 years to drastically improve the amount of protection in the sea and on land. So we're under a lot of time pressure to give the EU and national governments information about where they should place protected areas. And it's not just about marine protected areas or terrestrial protected areas, it's also a lot of other things built into these high-level policy objectives, such as restoration of habitats, handling of climate change, and lots of other kinds of management of pollution, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of work to do. And I think if we had 10 PhD students, we couldn't even get close to even making a dent in the amount of work that needs to be done. So this is an illustration I like to show of the essential basic problem of conservation planning or conservation decision making. So let's just imagine we have a very coarse map with a 5x5 grid, and we have 3 species. The base objective of conservation planning is to figure out where we should protect. Now, ideally we would want to protect everything, okay? But that's not possible in practice because we have to use natural environments for resources and various other things. So we usually work within the constraint of we can protect a certain amount of the area. So let's say we can protect 10 grid cells out of 25 here. Now, what would be the best solution in that case? So if we sat down in a group and we looked at this map, we could probably figure out what would be the best solution. Okay, these pixels in the middle sort of cover 2 species at once, so we can get 2 species in one grid cell there, and so on and so forth. We could maybe come up with a good solution. We could protect 3 or say 10 grid cells. But if you actually do the maths, this is the equation to figure out if we can protect 10 of those grid cells and there's 25. This is the number of possible different combinations of 10 grid cells. So we might think we can sit down as a group and come up with a good solution, but we would probably need to cover 3 million different possible combinations to know for sure if we got the best possible solution. And this is with just 25 grid cells. So for fun, I put 25 grid cells on the Baltic Sea, which is where I work mostly, and that looks something like this. And if you showed this map to managers in the region and you chose 3 grid cells and said we should make these marine protected areas, then you would get laughed out of the room. And so what we actually work with typically is a resolution of 250 meters, which in the Baltic Sea you end up with something like 5 million grid cells. And if we run the maths again, you end up with this number of possible different solutions, which is just an impossibly large number. I think the number of atoms in the universe is by 10 to the power of 80 or something. So it's essentially infinite. So this is the challenge of conservation planning, this huge solution space trying to figure out what's the best way to allocate our resources and our budgets for conservation so that we can get the best bang for our buck. So this is just with the simple example. But reality, unfortunately, is much more complicated. There's not just species and protected areas. There's socioeconomics we have to think about. We have to think about equity and human rights. Who uses these resources? How would they suffer from a protected area? Can they no longer fish in these locations? We have the dynamics of human exploitation. Which areas are being fished most intensely? Which areas are subject to eutrophication and pollution? Climate change comes in there. Are the species going to shift in their range over time? How do humans behave? Are they even going to comply with the protected area? They might decide, no, this is where I like to fish. You can put a marine protected area there, but I don't care. I'm still going to fish there. And politics, I mean, that's goes without saying. So here's an example of just one aspect of this, which is cost. So an extra dimension we can add to things is how much does it cost to set up a protected area. So if you look at how much vegetation gets cleared from land and what that land actually costs, fortunately you find no correlation at all, which is really exciting. We don't want a correlation there. It means that there's lots of bargains in conservation. There's lots of very cheap land that is likely to be bought up and cleared in the near future. And so one of the challenges is trying to gather all this kind of information and try and figure out, okay, what's the best places to protect with all of this information? There's a variety of different conservation decision support tools. Mark San is like the godfather of systematic conservation planning, and there's a few other tools. More recently has come out this R package called Prioritize R that can use the Garobi optimizer. So somehow, as I said, I'm not a super technical person, but this tool can find optimal solutions to these complex problems. Well, actually, simple problems. So if you just have species distributions and you can protect 30% and so on, it can actually find the optimal solution and it can do it very fast. But as I mentioned, the systems are often more complex. So there's other tools like zonation especially, and this very recently published tool called Captain, which uses artificial intelligence to try and gather all of these different pieces of information and come up with solutions that work in dynamic systems. So when species ranges are shifting over time, when there's uncertainty in the data, and so on and so forth. So this is really exciting and it hasn't been used very much, and I think it's something that could be really promising, especially in the Baltic Sea. So, with that in mind, the challenges of conservation planning, I wanted to get into the topic of biodiversity mapping, of which species distribution modeling, which Ocean has spoken lots about now, is part of. And it's an enormous task, and it is the foundation of all the decisions we make later on in conservation planning. So we can't really decide where we want to protect unless we know where things are. And it's not just about knowing where species are, but it's about knowing where ecological functions are. Which species are filtering out the water and cleaning it? Which species are providing refuge for other species? Some species might be higher up in the food chain, impacting other species, and so on and so forth. And any errors in this information leads to errors in the decision-making process later on. So at the moment, we're working mostly within this large EU Horizon project called Protect Baltic, and part of that project is to map the distribution of 3,000 species in this area. It's the Baltic Sea, but it also includes parts of Kattegat and Skagerrak on the west coast, which slightly inflates the species number because the Baltic Sea is known for not being very species rich. Although it's not species rich, it's quite interesting because it's a brackish water system. So you find freshwater and saltwater species living together where you don't find them in other parts of the world. So this is an enormous task, and on top of that, we're using that information to identify habitats and species communities, so which species are coexisting and which are important for ecosystem services. Maybe ecosystem services is something that's not so well known, but you know, what benefits do these species provide? So do they provide food for people, or do they regulate climate, carbon storage, so on and so forth? And then on top of that, we're aiming to do climate scenarios, so projecting species distributions into the future, and use all that information to come up with suggestions for how we should, in the Baltic Sea, expand our marine protected area network to best satisfy all of these different objectives. So, the species distribution models that we built, that we are building, for input data, we have lots of different data sets, and it's coming from different countries. So in Sweden, we're very fortunate to have a long history of data collection. So Ocean was talking about the presence, absence observation and collecting of field data, or in your case, collecting of citizen science data. We're working more with field data, so these are people on our field research team who go out and they put nets in the water and they catch fish, and then they count how many fish they caught, what size they were, what species. It's all very manual labor intensive. Maybe this is actually another avenue that could be improved through some other AI techniques. So they've been doing that in Sweden for a long time, over 40 years in some of the programs. There's net fishing, there's detonation fishing, which sounds bad, but it's not that bad. They're tiny little explosives. Okay, it sounds pretty bad. But I mean, if you catch fish in a fishing net, I mean that's bad. The fish die. There's tiny little explosives that you put in the water, and it stuns the fish, and they float up to the surface, and you can record which fish species you found. And the reason that that's important is because that's the only thing that works on juvenile small fish. They slip through the nets, so you can't actually monitor small juvenile fish, so we can't see where fish are spawning without that information. Okay, I'll speed up here. So we've used a variety of different techniques for our species distribution modeling, but I would call them more sort of standard machine learning techniques and more statistical models. Here's the full list. And you know, they perform quite well, we think, you know, but I think there's a lot of potential to improve these with more sophisticated deep learning models. But a crucial part is that we need to understand and not just predict. We don't need to make maps, but we need to understand why the species is occurring there. Is it because of salinity or temperature, so on. Here are some examples of some of the climate scenarios we've done with Sprat. This is very, very experimental. I wouldn't take this map too seriously, but here's the present day prediction of the distribution and the prediction under RCP 8.5 in the year 2099. And this map, yeah, kind of makes my heart sink that the species would more or less vanish from the Baltic Sea, apart from a few refuges. But what makes my heart sink even more is what higher level management people implementing protected areas might do with this kind of information. And it's scary to see what might happen, but it's also scary to see how the decisions might be wrong if these models are wrong. So we need to make sure that the model's good. Something we also do is connectivity modeling. So using the species distribution models, we can use Lagrangian particle trajectories to see where species move, especially larvae of fish and invertebrates, how they move with currents in the ocean. This is another layer of biodiversity information that goes into the decision-making process. And then we combine all of that to come up with suggestions for where the Marine Protected Area Network could be expanded in the future to meet all of these conservation objectives. So finally, I wanted to just wrap up. I mean, this presentation is not so much about how much we've done with AI, which is very little. It's more of a call for help, or a cry for help from all of you, that we would could really use some expertise. As I mentioned, we're all ecologists, and I think there's huge opportunities to start working with computer scientists and people who can make these models so much better than what we currently have, so that, you know, so we can meet these objectives by 2030 and do a good job by then. So this is one example. Ocean mentioned joint species distribution modeling. I think typically that's not what happens at these lower scales. We model one species at a time, and we don't think about the interactions between species. This is an example with stickleback and predatory fish. Over time, stickleback have moved in to the inner parts of the Stockholm archipelago, and they predate on the eggs of the predatory fish, which causes these sort of ecosystem shifts. So you can't really make a good model of perch without also incorporating information on stickleback, because it's extremely relevant whether stickleback was also in that location or not. I think there's a lot of potential for hindcasting. So not only predicting where species were expected to be in the future, but where they have been in the past. There's this issue of a shifting baseline. So if we look at the Living Planet Index from WWF, you can see that their comparison is from 1970. But if you look at information on biodiversity over longer time periods, you can see that in 1970, we were already pretty low. And so it's not really about what was there in 1970, it's about what was there, 1,000 years ago. Or maybe that's too far back, but a couple of hundred years ago. So we can really see, if we need to restore the habitats, well, what's our reference for what's a good habitat? And I think these deeper learning models can, especially when we have good temporal data covering several decades, we can project back into the past to see where habitats and species were in the past. And finally, I think there's so much promise with this, using these convolutional neural networks to to simply build the species distribution models. At the moment, we have lots of information, environmental predictors on salinity and temperature and so on. But when you build the model, if a species is here, all that goes into the model is, this is the depth. If we imagine this is the contour of the seafloor, let's say the depth there is 20 meters. Well, this species is also at 20 meters. Let's say they're at the same depth. All that goes into that model is that the depth of that species observation is 20 meters, and it's the same there. But the convolutional neural networks have the capacity to use information not only at that point, but around it. So this species is at a peak underwater, and this species is in a valley. So it can identify these complex species niches, and it can do that not just with one variable like depth, but with everything, temperature, salinity, in a three-dimensional array. And that, to me, seems to be not only useful for prediction, but also for understanding. Whether or not it's too black boxy and difficult to really interpret, I still think it would be useful. Thank you very much. And just reach out to me if you want to work together.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for 2 questions. So,
thank you. Super interesting.
Thank you.
I'm a computer scientist. I'm happy to help.
Yeah, great.
But I was just wondering, have you ever used audio?
Audio? No, we've never used audio.
Because I can imagine that underwater sound is pretty important. I was just wondering if you've ever considered monitoring fishes through sound analysis.
No, I mean, they use underwater acoustic data, but not sounds actually coming from the animals themselves. No, that's a really interesting idea. There's a really funny story about the Swedish military thinking they were being invaded or something from an underwater submarine, and they found out it was just herring farts.
And then I have a little other question, which is in terms of time. So I guess it's like species move. So in your space, do you know if currently marine protected areas do take time into consideration?
Very rarely. It's a huge problem. It can take years to just actually implement a single marine protected area. And then if you want to move it, because the species have shifted or whatever in the future, you've got to go through the whole political process of de-gazetting a marine protected area. There's sort of theoretical discussions of having shifting MPAs and or marine protected areas, but it's very difficult because you need to tell fishermen or something, this is where you can and cannot fish, and you can't just keep changing that every year because it's a huge challenge.
I was even thinking more like seasons or whatever. Like in summer, this area is a no-go.
Oh, right.
But then during the winter, it's fine.
Yeah, typically there'll be different sort of information that goes into, so they'll identify wintering areas for birds or spawning areas for fish, and that would be the objective of that marine protected area, is to protect those areas. And another one might be protecting the adult habitat. Yeah, yeah.
I think with that we have to thank Edward once again. I believe you are around for